Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dan Smith, Director of CIPRI.
Well, good afternoon, or good morning, or good evening, or whatever it is, wherever you are. Welcome to the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development, convened this year as every year by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute and the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but of course, convened this year with a difference for reasons that we don't really need reminding about. In these exceptional times that we live in, we've gone online. And it's been extraordinary, the response that we've received, really, really extraordinary. Over 2,000 participants from 60 countries in an online event put on with 32 partner organizations. It's been a monumental effort that the team at CIPRI and the Foreign Ministry have made in the last 2, 3, 4 weeks, along with the partner organizations. And here we are now to discuss sustaining peace in the time of COVID-19. Obviously, this requires that we look at the short term and at the long term. We look at the crisis of today and we look at the crisis of tomorrow. And we're going to kick off now with an introductory session with 2 panelists. One with me in the studio, Rawet Rydberg, who's the State Secretary for Foreign Affairs here in Sweden. And the other joining us online is Jessica Mathews, former president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a board member of CIPRI, so in a sense, my boss, so I'll be nice to her. And of course, also a member of the Harvard Corporation, which is the governing body of that university. So, Robert, this is the 7th annual forum. We've worked together, CIPRI and the Foreign Ministry, to put it on, aiming to bring together the security, humanitarian, development, peace communities to consider the problems of the day. It's grown in scale. It's become an important moment in the calendar of peace and development each year. And right now, it takes place, obviously, in the context of COVID-19. As I said, we don't need one heck of a lot of reminding about that. It's affecting us all every day. We've taken the forum online. We've got probably a more diverse audience than ever. A lot's changed, but a lot of concerns persist. So from your point of view, as we start this forum off, what are your thoughts on where our focus should be and how should we take things forward?
Hi Dan, great pleasure to be here, and as you said, the 7th year that the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs co-hosts the Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development with CIPRI. Promotion of peace and development, the themes of this conference, obviously priorities of Sweden and of the Swedish Ministry. Issues of no less concern today under the very special circumstances that we are facing. First of all, thank you very much to CIPRI and for all the parties for organizing this, and really congratulations on flexibility and rapidity in organizing the forum in this new, innovative, digital manner. I think it's important from my perspective to stress that diplomacy cannot be put in quarantine. And the discussion on security, peace, and development is even more important today than yesterday. The pandemic makes this discussion more timely. The pandemic does not only produce an unknown number of deaths and people in need of medical care, it has already produced the worst economic crisis for decades, rapid growth in unemployment worldwide, and a major setback in the global fight against poverty. The already weak suffer, as is usually the case, the most. And there is the obvious risk that this will sharpen local conflicts in many regions of the world. We also see how it already is sharpening existing geopolitical tensions, including between great powers. And this will come with serious consequences for global peace and security, and certainly also for international trade, upholding our economies. We see that restrictions in travel and movement make peace building and humanitarian interventions more difficult. Understandably, during the first initial response of the pandemic, most countries focused on domestic crisis management, but the virus does not respect borders, nor will its political and economic consequences. No chain is stronger than its weakest link. There will be a time for us to evaluate and draw lessons from how we tackle this crisis. But I think it's already now obvious that we got off to an unnecessarily bumpy start. There were warning signs and opportunities missed, not only by the country in which the pandemic started. We have seen lack of coordination, which sometimes has meant that measures taken by one state has made the situation worse for others. Here in Europe, the EU was unfortunately rather absent at the outset, but is coming back in a stronger manner, I'm happy to say. In my view, effective multilateral institutions are essential, not least in a global crisis like this one. And I'm happy to see many representatives of major international organizations, the UN, the World Bank, the European Union, OSCE, African Union, etc., taking part at the Stockholm Forum. This is important, and I'm sure that they will help us, will help the Forum to focus on the issue of how to strengthen multilateral cooperation in response to a crisis that really calls for multilateral responses. Diplomacy and dialogue really are more important than ever, and this is precisely a platform for dialogue, a counterweight to those who want to take advantage of the pandemic to weaken cooperation. That's why I'm so happy that the Stockholm Forum can go ahead, albeit in a different format this year.
I mean, I think that's really important. We're pulling out diplomacy and dialogue more important than ever. International cooperation more important than ever. And I think there are these two narratives going in different directions. One is, us alone, slam the doors. And the other one is, we've got to work together. And I mean, it's Sweden's tradition to push on the we've got to work together. So if I now turn to you, Jessica, and first of all, actually, I need to say to the online audience that just before we came on air, we discovered that there was a problem with the connection. And so Jessica is coming to us with a kind of hybrid hookup through a telephone rather than being here and coming through the main platform. This may be going to happen a couple of times during the course of the next couple of days. In some places, probably the signal or the link is not going to be that strong. Bear with us. We all have to adapt around this. And first of all, Jessica, I want to check again that you can hear me, because I can only see a picture of you and you can't nod, but you can hear me.
Yes, I can see. I can hear you fine, and it's a huge pleasure and a privilege to be with you, with Minister Rydberg, and with this enormous audience.
So what I want to do, Jessica, I want to ask you to pan out a bit and take a longer-term view of this context. So, back in the day, 1997, you published a groundbreaking article in Foreign Affairs called Power Shift. And in it, you discussed the world of globalization of technology, finance, commerce, civil society, and how it's producing a new diffusion of power, a new lineup. New actors are coming into the picture in the private sector, among international organizations, and of course in non-governmental organizations. One of the results you suggested was a changing view of security, which emerged perhaps a little bit less from thinking foreign relations and military strength, and a little bit more the concept of human security, thinking about the conditions of daily life and the availability of food, shelter, employment, and the provision of public health. And of course, that is one of the reasons why that article seems so apposite today. So, do excuse me for this, but I want to ask you a multi-part question. First part is that power shift continuing despite other changes that we've seen in global politics during the past decade? The second one, picking up on the point where Robert ended and the thing I took out of that, the two narratives, do you think the pandemic is going to be pushing us towards more cooperation or less? And thirdly, if you can bring those two things together, how do you see the outlook for issues, including peace and development, issues of human progress in the 2020s?
Well, let me tackle that as well as I can. The shift has certainly continued. It has empowered digital technology, and the weaponization of social media has empowered negative forces in the world in a way that was impossible to foresee in 1997. But what I actually foresaw when I wrote that piece was that for several decades, these new power centers, non-governmental power centers, private sector, multilateral ones, were going to exist next to and rubbing shoulders with, jostling against national governments.
Right.
And that would be an uneasy coexistence for many decades. And I think that's exactly what we're seeing, that it goes back and forth in periods of active conflict. The power shift goes more towards national governments. At other times, it goes more in the opposite direction. And we're seeing that anxious, difficult jostling of these two very different sources of power in our system right now. Secondly, is the pandemic pushing us more towards cooperation or less? I think the answer, if you'll forgive me, is it's doing both, and it's too early to see how this plays out. For example, science, which has always been an international enterprise, has never been as tightly integrated as on a global level as it has been over the last 8 weeks. It's really extraordinary what's going on in sharing of work, in collaboration, in publication. It's a tightly knit global enterprise. Secondly, we have seen both the importance of the WHO, the World Health Organization, and its weaknesses. And we know that international organizations can only be as strong as national governments allow them to be. I don't think we know yet, I know we don't know yet, the full story of China's transparency, lack of same in those early weeks with the WHO. I think it is not too soon to say that the WHO could have been better, and China certainly could have been better with what it shared with the WHO, its transparency, its access to researchers from there, from the U.S. and elsewhere. So I think the importance of the WHO comes through very strongly, and also its weakness. But finally, on the other side, you see governments all over the world, not just the U.S., reevaluating the wisdom of lengthy global supply chains, and a sense that more things that are important for national security in the broad sense should be made at home or stockpiled at home. And there is certainly a second look at the wisdom of long global supply chains. So my point is that you could see pushes and pulls towards more cooperation, more realization of our interdependence, and a sense that we would be stronger and safer with more of a national basis. So you see both of those going, and I think you don't yet know how it's going to turn out.
Yeah. So the jury is still out, and how do you? I mean, okay, the jury is still out. We don't really know how things are going to go forward.
Yeah,
but what do you think the issues are as we look ahead into the 2020s on the big peace and development questions? I mean, do you have some kind of a take on what you think the direction of travel is?
Yeah, I think that this experience will remind people, if you forgive the cliche, but how small this planet has become. Mm-hmm. And it will, I think, refocus attention on global scale change. There's plenty of reason to believe that this very striking increase in the number of these viruses that have jumped from animals to humans is in part not just the result of more people and more economic activity, but also the result of habitat destruction, which brings people and these animal hosts closer together. And that, in part, comes back to climate change. So everything is tied together. I think we will be paying much more attention to these non-geopolitical threats. If you'll forgive an American viewpoint here, I think the question of what this coming decade looks like depends an awful lot on whether Donald Trump is defeated in November, because he does represent a view of the American role in the world that is outside the boundaries of both Democratic and Republican administrations for the last century. So, or certainly since the end of World War II. So I think, November, the first week of November, is an awfully important milestone for determining what this decade will look like, and in particular, a restoration, one hopes, of the tight Euro-Atlantic relationship that has been shredded by him.
I think it is very salutary that you remind us about that, and I hope it's not a depressing reminder. I hope it's a cheerful reminder that in November things in terms of international cooperation could be changing for the better. The UN's just announced. The UN's just announced that all in-person meetings are postponed until June at the earliest, and it may go on for longer. We don't really know when a new normal will return, and we don't really know what a new normal is actually going to look like. Amid all of that uncertainty, I mean, what do you think about the value of gatherings like the one that we're having now, the Stockholm Forum in general, and doing it online in particular?
Yeah, we will have to learn how to develop this technology and how to adjust ourselves to being able to debate, discuss, negotiate even online. It's going to be terribly difficult. But I think even once there is a vaccine, and once that vaccine is clearly is distributed around the world, things will still be different. I think there will be less travel. I think there will be fewer in-person meetings both in business and in diplomacy. And it's going to take some getting used to. My hunch is that 5 years from now, we will look back on a gathering like the one we're taking part in right now as having been beginners technology, and we will have to learn how to function in a very different world. Some parts of that, will be a plus. Much less airplane travel, for example, is certainly going to be a huge plus for slowing climate change. But getting over the essence of looking across the table at somebody, of being in the same room with them, the importance of interpersonal relations in international negotiations, of which Robert knows as well as anybody, that's going to be, I think, very, very difficult to surmount.
It's the immaterial, isn't it, which is as important as anything else. I mean, it's not just what you say, but in many contexts it's how you say it and how people react, and the body language and the unstated communications, and also thinking from the point of view of a ministry or an organization, or you've run a major think tank, the casual bumping into each other that people do.
Right. What gets said apart from the microphone?
Yeah.
What gets said with body language, even with physical touching, all those things are such an important part of reaching agreement in a difficult situation.
Yeah.
And also, there's the simple. It's not simple. There's the actual drama of being physically present in a room that can sometimes change outcomes in big ways. Well, we may have to learn how to do with less of that.
Yeah. So, Jessica, thank you so much, and especially, I mean, I don't know if you can see us, but I can't see you, and so it does feel like a very distant communication in some kind of way that actually demonstrates both the advantages and the difficulties that we were just talking, the upside and the downside of online communication. If I turn now to you, Robert, for a couple of last words, I mean, what do you hope to see coming out of this forum? The time where we are now, what would be, as we kick it off, what would be 2 or 3 good takeaways for those of us who are participating in it?
Well, thank you. I think at this moment I see 2 particular competitive advantages for a forum like the Stockholm Forum. The first competitive advantage is that it brings together a range of issues, from hard security, peace, traditional issues, to the development and humanitarian field. And it seems to me that an experience like the one we have seen the last few months sort of breaks down the distinction between hard security, soft security, and development issues in a way to which this forum can respond very, very well. Second aspect is that the participants here range from government to civil society, international organizations, and academia. I think that type of cross-cutting audience is also particularly important in a challenging moment like this. So I hope that there will be a profound discussion on how this affects global cooperation. From a Swedish perspective, also in a year where we are preparing for the 2021 chairmanship of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, I would have a particular hope that there will also be a focus on what can regional organizations and regional cooperation contribute in a situation like this. Another particular wish would be that you will be able to use this digital working method, digital forum, to reach out to a wider audience, to be able to have a stronger involvement, perhaps also of participants from countries affected, ridden by conflict, who would have probably had more difficulties in traveling to a physical event, but can participate more easily now. I also hope that there will be a better engagement, a stronger engagement of young people at this 2020 Stockholm Forum. So I'm very much looking forward to an exciting event here in Stockholm and worldwide.
And worldwide. I mean, that's the extraordinary thing, is that indeed there are downsides, there are difficulties, but there are also benefits, especially in the diversity of people who can participate. The thing which I'm taking away from this session in particular is the importance, if we're thinking about developing more resilient responses on COVID and also other issues, including peace, climate change, the economy, inequalities, the importance of two values in particular: the importance of knowledge and the importance of cooperation. And it seems to me that those two things are at the heart of this Stockholm Forum. So what I want to do now is to hand over to Sigrún Rawet, who is CIPRI's Deputy Director, who's going to talk you through some of the highlights and some of the ways in which to connect some of what you can connect with during the forum in the coming days. So thank you very much to Jessica and to Robert for the first session, and on we go.
Dear friends, we are certainly living in strange times, times that brought a totally new challenge, while at the same time we're dealing with the old one. But now we have an opportunity. We have 10 interesting days together where we will meet, we will discuss, and I hope we'll find ways forward. And we have been really pleased by this enormous interest in participating. So we're very happy about that, and that we are getting people from so many parts of the world. And some of the discussion will of course be on the effects of the COVID-19 pandemic on international peace and security. But other discussions will be on already existing challenges, such as climate change and inequalities. We will start this week with a week of flagship sessions. We'll meet here at 15 hours Central European time every day. This is in order for you to be able to log in from different time zones. So make sure to be here. And do not miss Wednesday this week, Wednesday 11th of May. We will have a fantastic peace builder from Mogadishu, Ilbad Ulman, who will be addressing us with her keynote speech on sustaining peace in a changing world. There will also be a message from the Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, as well as words of welcome from the chair of the CIPRI Governing Board, Jan Eliasson. This will then be followed by a panel with, amongst others, the Swedish and the Sudanese foreign ministers, as well as the Secretary General of the OSCE. But all of you are very important for us. So please come and participate. You can engage by being part of question and answers, polling sessions, and we will also have a direct messaging function, so you can be in contact with others that are here for the Stockholm Forum. But also engage on social media and use the hashtag Stockholm Forum. You can view us at all times during this platform where you're currently viewing us, but also on YouTube with the CIPRI.org YouTube channel. So as you can imagine, there are so many things happening this week, but to get an overview or to look for an especially extra session, go into the CIPRI.org website and get the whole and the full program. And as you're aware, it's the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs and SIPRI. We're proud to be co-hosting this forum, but really we could not have done any of this without our amazing Stockholm Forum partners. We have more than 30 partners from all over the world that will be leading daily sessions. And our partners, they are from international organizations, from civil society, from think tanks. So a special thanks to all of you. We could really not have done this without you. But for now, stay tuned. There will be a short break. Maybe bring a coffee and enjoy and engage in the first panel of the Stockholm Forum on Women, Peace and Security, which we're doing in partnership with Kvinna and International Alert. And it is moderated by Charlotta Sparre, who's part of the Swedish network of women mediators. And once again, welcome to 2020 Stockholm Forum.
Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Charlotte Spader, Director of the Swedish Dialogue Institute for the Middle East and North Africa.
Welcome back to this second part of the opening session of Stockholm Forum on Peace and Development 2020, and to this high-level panel on women, peace and security, lessons from the past and roadmap for the future. This session has been prepared in cooperation with two important NGOs, the Kvinna Foundation and International Alert. These days, we are seeing many meetings celebrating the 20th anniversary of the groundbreaking Resolution 1325. Many sessions are being there to celebrate the achievements that have been made on the women, peace and security agenda. Our session here today is a session that aims to bring the focus on the women peace builders working on the ground. It will be in a dialogue with representatives from civil society, from government, and from the UN. And we will be discussing how we can better support women peace builders. With us today, we have a fantastic panel with a Nobel Peace Prize laureate and with representatives from civil society, government, and from the UN. Before turning to the panel, I will just say a couple of words on the structure of the session and on the topic at hand. We will start with brief presentations by the Kvinna and International Foundation and International Alert on recent research that they have been doing. We will then turn to our eminent panelists to get their insights, experiences, know-how. Towards the end, we will have a chance to answer your questions. So please, if you have any questions during the sessions, you can chat them in, and we will try to answer as many as we can. The Women, Peace and Security Agenda, with its 10 resolutions, is a product of tireless efforts from women's movements. Since the adoption of the resolution 1325, 20 years ago, many achievements have been made, but much work remains to be done. We are also now living in an unprecedented crisis where the COVID-19 pandemic will lead to consequences that we today have great difficulties in fully understanding. But what we do know is that we will see a lot of uncertainty and unstable times laying ahead. So in this session, we look forward to getting the insights from the panels, looking at what we have achieved during the 2 decades and what more needs to be done. We will be looking at how stakeholders can ensure that peace efforts during this crisis are making sure that women are really included in the processes. We will see how women peace builders are working, what are their challenges and what are their achievements. And we will be looking at how the international community at best can support them. I will now join the panel and invite the Kvinna Foundation and International Alert to share some recent research and look at what the women peacemakers on the ground have been achieving. Thank you. So I'm now turning to Petra Tuchman, Secretary General of the Kvinna Foundation. Petra, today, actually, this very day, Kvinna is releasing a new report. And I would like you to tell us a little bit about the findings that you have done.
Yes, thank you. Well, like you mentioned, it's the 20th anniversary of Resolution 1325, and we wanted to ask, what has worked and what has not worked 20 years down the line with this resolution. But one thing that was really central in asking was who we actually put these questions to. So we chose to talk to the women for whom this agenda should be most relevant, women on the ground in conflict-affected countries that work every day in their communities to build peace. So for this report, which is called A Right, Not a Gift, we have interviewed 91 women peace builders in 6 conflict-affected areas around the world. And the title is a quote from one of the participants from Syria, who stated that women need to know that participation is a right and a duty towards her country, and it's not a gift given by men. So in short, I am confident in saying that 1325 has made a difference for women peace builders. They have used this platform to mobilize and build coalitions between women. They have used it to raise awareness on women's rights in their communities. And they have also used it to push the policy agenda to change, to increase women's rights and gender equality. So I think that it's fair to say that 1325 has helped many women to claim a right and a voice at the table. However, when talking to them about what really matters in their life and what makes a difference for their ability to carry out the work building peace and working for women's rights, it became very clear that there were 2 areas that needs to much more be integrated in the women peace and security agenda. And the first one is about the economy of conflict and integrating an analysis of women's economic opportunities and discrimination when they talk about participation. And we know that the lack of women's economic empowerment in combination with corruption, which is very common in fragile countries, is a key challenge, and not only to women's participation, but to prevent violence against women and also inclusion in decision making. And just like you mentioned, this is a consequence that we can see now in the COVID-19 crisis as well. Women's marginalized space and economy is always a threat to them and makes them vulnerable in all sorts of crises, regardless if it's violent conflict or natural disaster or, in this case, a pandemic. And the second area that the women brought up very clearly is the insecurity that women face due to violent extremism and shrinking civic space. And it's important that the women, peace and security agenda more thoroughly includes this topic and not only looks at how violent extremism is a security threat to women, but also in the way in which women peace builders every day in their community use a myriad of ways to mitigate violent extremism and prevent it.
So based on these findings that you have made, what are your recommendations to the international community? And today we have representatives of the UN, of governments. We also have other colleagues working on the ground.
Yes. In the short time that I have now, I would like to offer 3 key recommendations that we draw from the interviews. And I would just like to stress that there were 91 women from 6 very different conflict countries and geographically quite spread as well. But still, it was not hard for us to draw these conclusions from all of these areas. And the first one is what I already talked about. It is to look at the fundamental discriminatory structures that really needs to be part of the analysis and the actions. And otherwise, quite literally, we're putting band-aids on gunshot wounds. And it's about women's housing, land and property rights came up many times in many of the regions. The economic violence against women that causes this poverty, and then the violent extremism that hinders women's freedom and participation. The second key recommendation that the women brought forward was to treat inclusive peace processes as investments. It is hard to have a really thorough and inclusive process. It won't happen by itself, but there are clear steps on how to do it. And naturally, women peace builders know what needs to be included, and we have those steps in our report. And the third one that I would like to bring up is to really anchor peace-building efforts in the communities that they're implemented in. Just national action plans on 1325s are not enough, and much more is needed to connect the work that goes on the ground with the work that takes place on international levels. And most women that we spoke to did not even know that there's more resolutions than 1325. So the gap between UN headquarters in New York and the communities in conflict-affected areas, it needs to be acknowledged so that it can be bridged. And I think that this is really important to bring forward now, as the UN is also in a process of the ongoing peace-building architecture review. So we can really feed that into that process as well.
Thank you very much, Petra.
Thank you.
And so you are head of gender at International Alert, and you have been working together with the Kvinna to Kvinna Foundation in preparing this session, and you have yourself a long experience of providing strategic leadership in gender in conflict transformation. Now that you have listened to Petra and the findings in their report, is this corresponding with your experiences? What are your additional thoughts? I know you have been doing some studies yourself also, so we would very much like to hear your reflections and recommendations. And are you with us? And are you with us? It seems as if we have some problems with the communication, so I suggest that maybe we come back to in a little while when that is solved. And I will, in the meanwhile, turn to you. You who are sitting watching this program, you have now been hearing the findings that the Kvinna to Kvinna has been presenting, and I would like you to answer and think about the following question. What do you think will be the main impact of the corona crisis for women peace builders? Will it, A, be a window of opportunity for change, or B, will it be a setback and lower chances for participation and influence? And while we wait for the responses to come in, let me introduce the impressive panel that we have with us. So on WebLink, we have Lema Bowie, Liberian peace activist and Nobel Peace Prize laureate, 2011. We have Parfait Onanga Anyanga, UN Secretary General Special Envoy at the Horn of Africa. And here with me in the studio, we also have Åsa Regnér, Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, and Per Olsson Frid, State Secretary for International Development Cooperation at the Swedish Foreign Ministry. So now looking at our question, we actually see that of the respondents, close to 60% are thinking that the COVID-19 can actually present a window of opportunity for change, whereas a little over 40% think that it will be a setback. I think this can be something interesting for our panel to reflect on. Before then turning to the panel, Nday, are you with us now?
Yes, can you hear us okay?
Wonderful. So did you hear my question earlier, or do you want me to repeat it?
Hello?
Hello, can you hear us? Can you hear us, Nday? It still seems as if we have some technical problems. So while our technicians are sorting that out, maybe I can turn to the first speaker.
Just put it in. I don't hear you.
Can we hear you now? Hello?
Hello. Yes.
Yes. So I don't know if you had a chance to hear Petra's presentation of the study they have made, but you have been working very closely with Kvinna to Kvinna on preparing this session. And it would be great if you could share some of your experiences and thoughts on women peace builders on the ground.
Okay, thank you very much, Charlotta. We are finalizing actually a research which explores how the Women, Peace and Security agenda has been experienced and implemented on the ground by peace builders in 10 conflict-affected states in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Southeast Asia over the past 2 decades. So what we found was that most women's organizations we talked to emphasize the value of the WPS agenda as a normative framework for the advancement and enshrining of women's rights in their countries, particularly around the 4 pillars of the WPS agenda. And in fact, one partner organization in the DRC told us that this resolution is our battleground and our main working tool. Resolution 1325 is our battleground and our main working tool. And they also emphasize the fact that the WPS and progress on implementation has been built on the foundation of a feminist movement, which underpinned, and actually it was underpinned by gains fought for by peace organizations, women's peace organizations, and actually women's rights defenders over several decades. However, the women we talked to also emphasize the persistent challenges and obstacles to a full implementation of the agenda in their context. These challenges are not new, and we will discuss 2 of them. The first one is about patriarchal and restrictive gender norms, which act as significant barriers for progress on the advancement of gender equality and the effective and comprehensive implementation of the WPS agenda. At the community level, in particular, this often takes the form of various types of pushback against women that are involved in advancing women's rights and the violence and the violence and their role in sorry. Okay, sorry again. I think that we still have some technical problems. But what I was saying is that then at the community level, this often takes actually the forms of various type of pushback against women that are involved in actually advancing, women's rights and their role in violence prevention. In Afghanistan and in Pakistan in particular, the patriarchal values of mostly male members of the family meant that actually women were actively discouraged and blocked from accessing WPS-related initiatives. The second challenge that I'm going to talk about is very closely linked to the first one, and is about the lack of political will and the lack of sufficient resourcing of the WPS agenda. And these barriers result in a lack of translation to tangible support to women's organizations on the ground. And here, once again, the testimony of interviewees shows that it is challenging to build the political will to address harmful cultural gender norms and practices that underpin the systemic, cultural, and direct violence towards women. And of course, there is also the lack of funding for actually implementing a national action plan. There is money to develop beautiful national action plans, but not to implement them. And one of the participants that we talked to said actually that very often NAPs are just a tick box exercise to boost countries' reputation. So in face of these two challenges, we have two recommendations that we like to make to donors, to the international institutions, and to national governments. And the first one, we believe is very important, is to engage with men and masculinities, to challenge the patriarchal framework and transform patriarchal gender norms and institutionalize male privilege. It is important to support initiatives to engage men more strategically, particularly men, the gatekeepers and the norm setters, such as the traditional leaders, local officials, central or local level political party leaders, but also being very mindful in doing so, not actually to reinforce their position of power. And the second recommendation we like to make is the need to support women's organization at national and community level. And what is needed for that is firm commitment to flexible, accessible, long-term and stable funding for actually women's organizations. Commitment to long-term and core funding enables organizations to operate in challenging environments and to become actually more, resilient with access to emergency funds. And this commitment is even more important in the current COVID-19 crisis, where actually funds are at risk of being diverted from the work of women peace builders. So I'm going to stop there for now.
Thank you,
Charlotte.
Thank you very much, Ndé. So we have been hearing from both Kvinna and International Alert on both the lot of work that is going on in the field and at a policy level. We have been hearing about some of the progress, but also the very long way we still have to go for a full implementation of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. You have both been touching on both economic realities, on the question of social norms, and the importance of touching upon it and dealing with them. The question of political will, that of course is absolutely essential. And of course now we have the current COVID-19 crisis. So I think this is something that I turn to all the panelists to maybe think of how you can integrate in the questions that I will be asking you and that we may be getting from the audience later on. Lema Bowie, as a prominent Liberian peace activist, you really have first-hand experience of what it means to lead women's nonviolent peace movements. Your efforts helped to bring an end to the Second Liberian Civil War in 2003. And in 2011, you were awarded with the Nobel Peace Prize with the following words: for nonviolent struggle, for the safety of women, and for women's rights to full participation in peace-building work. The peace in Liberia was a victory, really, for the women's movements, but it's, of course, also important to sustain the peace in the post-conflict context. And I would be very interested in hearing from you, looking at the work in Liberia today. How do you work? What would you say that the movement is getting in terms of support from the international international environment? What is it that can be done more? And what can we all do to help sustaining the peace?
Thank you, and I'm so happy to be here. One of the things that is very interesting with your question is that since the end of the war in Liberia, We have a movement that is very, very present in terms of the politics of Liberia and everything that is happening. However, the work that has been done is something that is cherished, but the actual reality on the ground is at several levels. One, maintaining or sustaining a movement takes a lot of work and a lot of resources. And what Inde said is something we're seeing every day. No more war, no more perceived suffering of women. So donors have shifted to those their attention and their resources to areas that they think is more trendy. So for Liberia, there's a lot of difficulty in accessing funding. What this has done to not just the movement, but to the work that women are doing is this whole thing of competition, negative competition on the basis of funding. When we did the mass action, it was a collaborative effort. After the mass action, after peace, individual women's organization are going back to where they came from. And everyone is trying to put a strong face out there in terms of the work, to the point now that people are trying to kind of like prioritize your priorities, ranking women's organization on the basis of how they get resources. And I think that's a real serious issue that every organization, not even Liberia, has to deal with. And Inde really nailed it on the head when she talked about accessible funding, flexible funding for women's work. Because sustaining a peace is not just going to be going into the streets and trying to do, but you need real concrete things to help people to solidify the peace. In the just ended 2017 elections, women again came out, but the resources that we were using to sustain the peace, remember the past, because those were the slogans that we're using in our communities, because we had a very contentious elections. It was difficult. We barely got enough money from donors to say, we want you to do this. And I think that's it. But one of my recommendation, and I'm just jumping quickly into it, would be that with all this beautiful research, I think as we look into funding, we need to begin to look into funding that bring together groups rather than divide them. What do I mean by that? Put out a call for proposal to say we will encourage women's organizations from the urban area to pair with rural areas to put forth proposals. In that way, you minimize negative competition, but you also build up small organization, rural organization, working together with urban organization. On the issue of the National Action Plan, again, I think we should just shut up and just follow everything that your research say, because the women in the field are saying it. National Action Plan, in my opinion, are just action plans to say that to make national governments look good in the eyes of countries that they believe have feminist foreign policy and that will give them money. So Sweden, if we write a beautiful national action plan, the Swedish government will be interested in this. One of my biggest, recently in Liberia, they put forth the National Action Plan, and I was at that consultative meeting. After presenting the National Action Plan, the budget of the National Action Plan was over $20-something million. That budget was 4 times more than the national budget of the Gender Ministry. It's laughable. It's a joke. If we have to be serious about women's issues, about National Action Plan, the talk must be accompanied by the resources. But to conclude, I think for women's movement to thrive, for the work that we continue to do on a day-to-day basis to solidify peace in our communities, there has to be solid investment. You can't go to a diamond store and buy a beautiful diamond necklace with peanuts. Peace is a gem, and you have to put solid investment in peace.
Thank you very much, Lema, and thanks for that very strong ending message of the first round of questions to you. With that, I would like to turn to Åsa Regnér. You have now been the Deputy Executive Director of UN Women for 2 years, but you have a very long experience of working on women's rights and gender equality. We have seen, as we have been touching upon several times already, the progress that has been made in the last 20 years. We have seen mainstreaming of the women, peace and security agenda, but it is far from implemented. So my question to you is really, how can we bridge the gap between the rhetorics and the reality? And what are the most important actions that are needed to bridge that gap?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to my co-panelists. I'm very honored to be here with you, and it's good to see you on the screen and here in this studio. Yes, I have been thinking a lot about the fact that from a New York perspective, you see a lot of support, as Lema also pointed out, for the women, peace and security agenda. A lot of support in more and more countries for feminist foreign policy. And obviously all of that is good because change normally begins with words. However, the lack of action, implementation and funding that you mentioned is really very disturbing, I have to say, because the gap between the rhetorics and the reality, the price of that gap is paid by women who literally carry their societies and their communities on their shoulders, but they are just left to do that. And are not remunerated for the work that they do many times, and they're definitely not getting the funding they need to continue organizing as feminists and women have always done, and who are the very start of the 1325 even happening in the first place. So I find this very disturbing, and I find that member states have an enormous responsibility here, and I also think that we at the UN do as well. The Secretary General is working very hard on the Women, Peace and Security agenda, and he has also several times pointed out that this gap needs to be closed. UN Women, a role that we have is to remind always about women's situation in conflict settings, and of course to know what is happening on the ground, and we do that through colleagues working in the countries and the connection that we have on a daily basis with the women's movement. I think also that we have an opportunity now. The COVID situation has obviously exacerbated lots of the problems. We already mentioned the risk of less funding. We know that a lot of violence is also increasing during the conflict. We've seen that in Libya, not least lately, and in other places as well. And we see that women suffer enormously because they are both, again, providing healthcare, but they might in many places also be, to a larger extent, victims of violence and might not even be able to go to healthcare facilities themselves when they need it because the infrastructure is not there. We also know that maternal mortality increases during these situations, and something that some member states have really showed lately, unfortunately, is that they're not standing on women's side when it comes to sexual and reproductive health and rights. So all of this, I think, still, to come back to the survey that is being done right now here in the studio, I think still that we have an opportunity to use the anniversary of the 1325, the 20 years, to really try to point this out. And find a way, if I can, and we are discussing with, of course, the women's movements and other experts, and I hope you want to be part of that discussion, how we can manage to put pressure even further on those who are responsible for solving the problems. That's both member states, parties in the conflicts, and of course, me, myself, and other UN colleagues who are there to actually solve the problem. I think that a problem that we have that we haven't solved yet is that international society still, when it comes to peace talks, see those who cause the violence as the most legitimate partners when it comes to stopping the violence and to discussing what will happen after the violence. And there has not really been a agreement around changing that way of thinking and what that actually means. And women understand this, and that's why they've come up with all these proposals, but it has not entered the DNA of this work in the Security Council in member states, and maybe also not yet in the UN. So I think that when it comes to the proposals, we have to work with all of them. But I think that most importantly is political will when it comes to actually seeing that change, and to also taking the debate and the conflicts around that when you have to reprioritize budgets and actually make this the most important issues, as member states say they will when they line up to speak in the Security Council during the open debate.
Thank you very much, Åsa, and not least for this strong stress on the importance of having an inclusive approach to the peace building. Moving from UN headquarters to the field, I would like to turn to Parfait Onanga-Anyanga. You have an extensive experience with the UN, both in the field and in headquarters, and you are now the Special Envoy of the Secretary General for the Horn of Africa. The Horn of Africa is a region that has been seeing a lot of change in recent times. The peace process between Ethiopia and Eritrea, the political developments in Sudan. But we're also talking about a region where that has witnessed a lot of violations of women's rights, and where the women's political participation is very low. So my question to you is how the UN can play a role in making sure that women really do play an equal part in society and in the reforms that are taking place. And I would also like to ask you personally, what are you doing as special representative in making sure that the voices of the women are heard at the different levels?
Thank you very much, Ambassador. And let me greet my fellow panelists. Your questions are absolutely pertinent. This is a region that has witnessed indeed a lot of suffering, but that is also going to a time of hope. Unfortunately, while I'm a stubborn optimistic, we have to acknowledge that the current pandemic is already having a pretty negative impact on the lives of millions in this region, whose daily life was already such a hardship, and which will now be compounded by COVID-19. And regrettably, as is often the case, women and girls are the first, affected, most affected by this difficult event such as the current pandemic. And this is what prompted the Secretary General to call for an immediate global ceasefire so that peace can be given a chance to ensure that those who are caught in this endless conflict are not simply forgotten, and to give also time for humanitarian action to reach these vulnerable people. I must say that I really sympathize and welcome the findings of this important research. And I do believe as well that women's have right. It's not about making them any kind of gifts. For me, the Women, Peace and Security agenda is first and foremost a cry for justice and protection of the human dignity of women. And that's why it is really fitting that we're having this conversation, and that although we still locked down, CIPRI and the Foreign Minister of Sweden are convening this meeting. And that's why I see at least 3 quick actions that we must really very quickly engage in. And I do believe that this time must be also for us all a time of opportunity for multilateralism, opportunity to re-engage. And I fully agree with the proposal that men must be engaged. And that's why, while I fully agree with the need not to invest too much in national action plans, I caution a bit not to throw the baby with the water, that we do have tools, we have mechanisms. Let's use those tools. Let's ensure that they are prioritized and that they are effectively used. And this is what, of course, partners, government, regional organizations, all of them must ensure that we have tools that put women at the center and that we can more effectively use. The same must apply also with strengthening cross-border mechanisms and the need to incorporate a gender perspective into the regional emergency responses that are being developed in the face of COVID-19, and of course all the recovery plans. But secondly, I think it's been said, and I think we have some sympathy for that we are living through a war, and that we're fighting an invisible war. And often we have seen it everywhere. Women have been really at the forefront of this war. My call is really, and this is my strong belief, that we should do everything to end this cycle of exclusion. And this must be broken. I do believe that it is not normal that women always on the front line, some of them even with bare hands, and they are still acting as real generals on the front lines. And therefore, it will be simply unacceptable that in times of relative peace, these women becomes only foot soldiers. This should not be allowed. I think we do have an opportunity to ensure, and that's why I agree with the proposal to ensure that let's move outside of the traditional frames to look at the role of women in society. And the dichotomy between this formal and informal engagement of women is irrelevant. I mean, I see Nobel Prize Lema. I mean, the work she did was never in an office. It was never formal. It was about leadership and engaging leaders and mobilizing the society. So let us give the due importance that the work of women. We've seen it in Sudan. We're seeing it in Somalia. We're seeing here, even in Ethiopia, with Mothers of Peace, who are doing an amazing job in terms of stabilizing the society. So this, I think, must be an area that we must explore more aggressively. Thirdly, I heard the call on how it is difficult to change mindset, and this is why I think we must be more proactive in implementing measures that must achieve change by design. And this is why we must hold government accountable to their pledges so that we can closely monitor everything they have committed to implement. And as someone who has spent time in the field, I think one area that is key is protection. And I think we must ensure at least two things. One, we must ensure that government treats sexual based violence, sexual and gender-based violence as a crime. And this is something that we can really work harder and give all our voice and put pressure on government to ensure that this is happening. Second, and this is for us, the UN, I think we're doing it, the Secretary General is absolutely clear on the need to ensure that we apply a strict zero tolerance policy against sexual exploitation and abuse. And that's why he has launched just last year his initiative on Action for Peace to ensure that we get closer to that objective. And this is a work in which I think we can see more progress in the coming in the period ahead. I will simply stop here to say that it's a personal conviction, and as the Secretary General has said on many occasions, it's about power. This is not going to be an easy fight, and that's why indeed we need more men who are mostly in position of power to understand that we're doing a disservice to our humanity if we continue to hold half of our societies, and sometimes even the majority of our society, away from the decision-making, from the decision-making processes. And this simply must stop, because it is in the vested interest of societies to ensure that women are fully engaged, women and girls are fully engaged in the work that we're doing. So, and I therefore hope that post-COVID-19, we will be able to re-engage and make sure that we advance this important agenda for humanity. Over to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And I think this strong call for 100% of the population to be 100% engaged for peace, both men and women, is of course key. And both when it comes to the question of patriarchal structure and national action plans and other things, I see that we already have a lot of questions coming in. But we still have one panelist. Per Olsson-Frid, State Secretary for International Development Corporations at the Swedish Foreign Ministry. You represent a government with a feminist foreign policy, and we have been hearing during these interventions of the importance of having an approach that deals with addressing patriarchal norms and maybe pushing a feminist agenda. So I would like to hear how you see that. What role can a government play? What role is Sweden playing? And maybe even a couple of words of the role that we played during our time on the Security Council a couple of years ago.
Well, thank you, Charlotta, and to the organizers also for including me in such a distinguished panel. It's truly an honor to share a stage and a studio with you and to take part and listen to all the experience that you provide to this conversation. Now, I mean, as a government, we represent a country. Countries are member states of the UN. Countries are shareholders of the World Bank. Countries are shareholders of the International Monetary Fund, of the international financial institutions. We are members of the WHO. We are members, we make up the world global community. So it is us who, in the end, decide to put these words that Resolution 1325 consists of onto paper. We bring it to the Security Council. We make it international law. So it's also us who have to make sure that we can live up to these words now. So going and moving from a normative agenda into an implementing agenda is, of course, our responsibility. We have to push the global institutions to move in this direction. We have to finance global institutions to move in this direction and to hold institutions accountable for doing so. And we need to be held accountable for making that happen in our turn towards our taxpayers and voters and populations. And we have civil society who has to hold governments accountable for living up to what we once agreed on. So of course, as a country, we have an immense responsibility. And as many of you have witnessed so far, yes, in 20 years, we made a lot of progress. But 20 years, it's a lot of time. I mean, and so we could have moved longer, and we have now seen a decade of procrastinated conflicts. It's tougher, it's harder to reach those peace agreements that are sustainable, that are durable, and therefore also, I think one reason for that is that we've sort of somehow forgot this new operandus mundi that we need to, or mundi operandus that we need to have, and moving into action from just words on this resolution. But again, I mean, thank you to Kvinna, to International Alert for keep reminding us, for keep pushing us, and for moving the agenda forward so that we can't stand still. Because I think that is one thing that I'm afraid of, that when governments and us included agree on these words, we think that the job is done. But it's not. That's when it starts. And I think that is a reminder to us. And I think this panel shows that we still have a lot to do. Now, clearly, peace processes needs to be more inclusive. And I think one key element of this, and this has also been touched upon in the panel, is to be a better listener. Because we know on the ground, and especially among informal networks of girls and women, we know the roots of conflict. We know conflict dynamic. So if we are a better listener, we could also, and invite to the table in a more inclusive way, I think we can also reach more sustainable, more durable peace processes, and therefore also peace that can last. But to listen is difficult, because often, as Åsa said, the ones who are in charge, or the reason why there is fighting, are the ones brought to the table when we need to also to find peace. But that is a thing that we need to turn around and say, maybe actually the opposite sometimes. Because we know that women are usually not the reasons for war, but men are. So again, as was also mentioned, to break down those patriarchal structures, to break down male privilege also on the local level is probably extremely important. And again, then we as parties need to listen. And of course, some countries are more involved in conflicts than others, also through proxies, and therefore the responsibility lies heavily on them. But Sweden, of course, can play a big role. We want to play a big role in this, by our, by development cooperation, by being able to finance civil society organizations, UN organizations, by being able to support and train and start networks of women's organizers in the field. We can provide an arena, let's say, for this talk, for this discussion, this conversation to happen, and we can make sure that there is at least this important listening space where women's voices could be heard. But again, this is not the only role we can play. I mean, we are not only a donor country, we are also a member state. So with the financial support for this agenda comes also a strong political voice. And you mentioned it. I mean, my government is a feminist government. We're convinced that the women and girls' resources, representation and rights should always be on the table. And it is our responsibility to always bring it to the table and to hold those accountable that they're listened to, and that's also part of the implementation plan. And we can do quite a lot as one country. In the term we had in the UN Security Council, just to mention two examples, we made sure that in all missions, references to women, to the Women, Peace and Security agenda is part of the mandate. All political, all peace-building missions. We also made sure that there's more briefings with civil society organizations on these missions. And that's an effort to create this space for a more inclusive process. So we could do that, but of course there's plenty of things still to do. And we and other member states that are now part of the Security Council need to continue to move this work forward. And we need, of course, to work in different forums to continue to push the Women, Peace and Security agenda. But of course, it's extremely important that we do so. And I know, I mean, I represent the Swedish government in a numerous forums, in international meetings, and also, you know, as this forum. And there is a high expectation on Sweden to continue to push for these questions. And we are very willing to do so, and we won't stop. Because I can hear, and I listen to these examples and more examples, that there's a lack of finance, there's a lack of political will, there's a lack of enough space for women's voices to be heard. And we can help provide that space. I had this privilege to visit Sudan a couple of months ago. And there's such a clear example of a country where this agenda is so important. This is a revolution made by women. and a transition government with a clearly a gender equality aspiration. And together with UN Women, Sweden has been able to put gender advisors in numerous positions within the new transition government offices. And what we see now is also recent decisions right up the feminist alley, if I can express it that way, a part of the Women, Peace and Security agenda. We should all be proud of that. But now we have to stick to it. We have to keep fighting so that we don't lose what we have won so far. I think celebrating 20 years of the Women, Peace and Security agenda is a great opportunity. It's the same year as the UN turns 75. It's the same year as the first year of the decade of action on the Sustainable Development Goals, global goals that we all agreed on. So this is a fantastic opportunity for us, but a window of opportunity doesn't come by itself. We have to push that window open. We have to grasp this moment. And if we do so, I'm convinced that the next decade could be more successful than the last decade in bringing peace to people, but doing so only by also making people, meaning women and girls, fully participation in these processes. But we can do it.
Thank you very much, Per. And I think this stress on everybody's responsibility is absolutely key. We now have a lot of questions that have been coming in, and we have very little time left. So the questions I will ask will be very brief. I will only be able to pick up on some of them, and I will ask you to be equally brief in trying to respond. So my first question is to you, Åsa, and that is from a peace practitioner in East Africa, who is asking how the international community can better support preventive efforts, including in countries which are not in conflict yet, but risk of getting into conflicts.
Thank you. That's an excellent question. And I think that many of you have the answers yourselves. So I think it's, for us from UN Women, very important to work together with you and collect those proposals. I also believe we do that in many countries through the programs that we have, which promote women's participation in politics or in other parts of decision making. I think, to establish that and to be both have women voters present, for women to be elected, and to have an infrastructure of that is one very important point. I also do think that when women can support themselves and sustain themselves, have their own incomes, that is crucial for them to be able to make decisions which are good for themselves, independent on others and perhaps abusive men. Little time, big question, little time, but those are some of the things I would say.
Thank you very, very much. And building on that question of economic opportunities for women, Lema, I would like to turn to you. We've got one question on the economic opportunities for women in rural setting, still very often being made by men. So what are the strategies that you suggest to engage men in playing a constructive role in increasing women's economic opportunities?
Well, that's a very unfair question because I think, when I say unfair, the person have all right to ask that question, but unfair in a sense that we should not be asking men permission for women's economic empowerment or for them to do anything. I feel like if we really want to see peace, and just piggybacking on the first question that was asked about sustaining peace in different countries, we first have to begin to really reframe the whole concept of WPS moving away from militarism into human security. And that human security would take a lot of political will from governments to begin to invest in the people, investing in the economy so that women don't have to seek permission from a town chief or a clan chief to be able to survive, investing in healthcare, investing in education, providing opportunities. But I think when we continue to look at the WPS agenda and it's still hinged on militarism and war and all of the different things, leaving out our basic human security needs, then we're in for trouble, because wars do not just start because the military are upset. in most of our communities, war started because people were not happy with the state of their life. The economy was not present for them. They couldn't get health care, they couldn't get other things. So they piggyback on the opportunities of their lack to launch war. And I think for any society to live in peace or to thrive peacefully, especially in Africa, we need to now begin to rethink how we do our security, how we do life. The budgets need to be more for healthcare, for education, for agriculture, and less for the military. Because in Sweden, most times when I give talks in Europe and other places, I ask young people, if someone brought an AK-47 to you to say, go and fight, would you fight? The answer is no, because they have no reason to want to declare war on their countries. They have access to things, they can see a future. In places like Libya, Liberia, Egypt, all of those places that have gone through war, if you ask young people, where do you see yourself in 5 years? They ask you, I don't even see myself in 30 minutes. If your society cannot respond to your basic human security needs to the point where you see a future, it makes it very easy for you to take on guns. So I think it is about people reprioritizing how do we now respond. And it's not just a women's issue, but it's an issue for every member of a society to feel catered for.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for those important reminders, Lema. And Petra, I noticed earlier in the presentation of your report and the report that I had a chance to have a pre-look at during the weekend, that the whole question of economic opportunities is something that you stress very much. So is there anything that you briefly would like to add from your side on this question?
No, I think nothing new, just to emphasize what's already been said and the concept of human security. And that was something that came up repeatedly in our study from all of these different countries. It's like if you don't feel safe, if you don't have your basic needs met, and naturally finances and economy is a crucial part of that, then you cannot, like Åsa said, you cannot leave a violent relationship. You don't have the time or the energy to try to enter into a political fora. It's a very basic minimum that you need.
Thank you, Petra. Then we have a whole set of questions on patriarchal structures and social norms and how to address them. And Parfait, maybe I turn to you first on with a question on how can we challenge conservative social norms within communities and institutions that hold back progress on the women, peace and security agenda?
That's a very tough one.
Especially if you have to be brief.
Let me say this: WPA's, Women, Peace and Security agenda does not happen in a vacuum, and unfortunately, it is grounded in reality, and the reality we know today is a tough one. And I bring back the notion of power again, because. Change will happen when societies evolve towards more democratic institutions, respect for the rule of law, and good governance. These are the issues that are actually at the core of the problems we face, where everywhere, particularly in the countries that I'm working in, these are the aspirations of the majority of the youth. These are the aspirations of women and girls. And therefore, there is a call here. It's a challenge for the leadership in those countries, because it's first and foremost a responsibility of governments. The UN, the international community and partners can be there to assist and support, but it has to be homegrown, nationally driven, and on. And this is why I do believe that this dialogue has to be first and foremost an internal dialogue. And I was pleased to see that women around the countries where this research took place have been clear to say that they believe 1325 has really changed their lives, because it has provided an opportunity to ensure that their voice is heard. So this is a process that is absolutely linked to the democratic process, progress of countries, and therefore we need to continue that conversation. I do believe that pandemics are really opportunities to change, and this is not. It's not the first one. We've seen others in history that have provided opportunity to fast-track change and ensure that there is policy transformation, but at the same time that we have voice and participation for those whose policies are affecting lives most. And therefore, let's make this really an opportunity. It's a challenge for government. I mean, the way this pandemic has stricken most countries is really, and I understand as far as Africa is concerned, for example, it's a slow-moving threat. We haven't reached the peak yet, but again, it's a call for governance, and that's why I'm very pleased to see that most governments, have stood up have risen to the challenge, and are trying everything possible to ensure that working together collaboratively, they can provide solutions to their people. And my hope is this will be seen beyond the period post COVID-19, so that we really understand that we must not relent until we have done everything possible to unleash the huge potential and talent of women across the world, and particularly in this continent. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, and we do not have very much time left. I had wanted to ask another question to Ende on the patriarchal structure, as you talked about that earlier, but I think I actually have to turn to you now as a panel for your final recommendations. What is it that we can do to actually move the agenda forward? You have all been very good, I must say, in coming with recommendations throughout, but if you want to sum them up and really just in a sentence each, and maybe Lema, if I can turn to you first, what is your recommendation for the international community? How do we take the women, peace and security agenda forward?
The first thing we need to do is to reframe WPS, moving away from militarism and taking into consideration human security, so that WPS is not just seen as a global South problem, but a problem that every country, every nation in the world has to deal with. That's the first thing. The second thing is money, funds. It's time for us to get the resources that we need. Thirdly, everyone said it, political will. Fourth and final is serious awareness on the agenda.
Thank you very much. You managed to squeeze in 4 recommendations there. Bravo. Åsa.
Thank you very much. I won't repeat those. I support them. Maybe to add that I recommend for us to make use of the anniversary of 1325. And I don't mean that will solve all the problems, but it might be, let's hope so, one of the first meetings where we can maybe actually meet. And also, if we cannot do that, I recommend to myself and everybody else to find very concrete ways of using that space to put pressure on that gap between rhetorics and reality to decrease. And I also, if I want to mention one more thing, and I was asked earlier about prevention, and many of you talked about men and the role of masculinities and men, and I think that is a very important thing. And I think the good news is that we have more knowledge through research and data about men as representatives of their sex and gender, not only as human beings in a normal human being. And we also have but the problem is often that we don't we have little islands of knowledge, but we don't scale it up enough. And I think that that is also something I recommend myself and others to do to a larger extent, to actually really work on masculinities and to involve men, and to do that also on a local level. Everything that we talk about has to be done on a local level as well.
Thank you very much, Åsa. Now I really urge the rest of you to be super, super brief. So, parfait, 1 sentence, your recommendation.
We must meet women where they are and invest in them, empower them where they are. That would be my strongest recommendation. Let us move away from structures, but to go meet women where they are, empower them, and give them a chance to transform societies.
Thank you very much. Per?
Well, I'm stuck with this previous recommendation on moving from militarization into human security, where I think really is key. I think ensuring and acknowledging that a peace process is not only a process that ends a conflict, but it sets the stage for a future, for decisions on healthcare, on education, on finances, on resources allocation, on democratic governance, on everything. That maybe could help us understand the necessity of making sure that women are empowered and included in the peace-building agenda in those processes. So I want to echo that recommendation, but as a government, adding to this, we need to be better at the ability to listen. Because I've learned, and I know from listening to this panel, that if we put our ears to the ground, if we listen to those girls and women in the field that are victims or actors or agents of change in a conflict, then we know what to do. So the ability to listen, that would be my primary recommendation.
Thank you, Per. And they, 1 sentence.
Yes. For us, I think that one of the problems is that the shrinking space and the dangers faced by actually women's rights organizations and actually women's rights defenders, peace builders, and civil society, both in conflict and non-conflict places, settings, is a cause of concern. So we believe that it is up to the international community, in solidarity with actually women peace builders and human rights defenders, to defend and to protect the legitimacy of the critical work that they do.
Thank you very much, Ande. Petra, your recommendation?
Well, I think it's along the lines with everyone else, but like you said, peace is more than what happens at the peace table. That does not mean that women and other marginalized groups don't deserve a seat at that table. You know, it is their right and their duty to contribute to the future of their countries, but really to see beyond this and look at the communities where the real change is happening and changing those discriminatory structures that really hinders them in fulfilling the agenda that they are set out to do.
Thank you very much, Petra. I think this has been an absolutely fantastic panel, touching upon so many different, big, difficult questions. We have already gotten a lot of recommendations, a lot of thoughts, ideas, and I would just like to very much thank this wonderful panel. First, thank International Alert and Kvinna to Kvinna, and they saw Petra Tuchman-Andorf for your preparation of the panel and for being here. I also would like very much to thank Lema Bowie. It has been an honor, and we're very grateful that you could be with us on this panel. The same thing, of course, Parfait Onanga, Anayanga. Thank you very, very much for being with us here today. Åsa Regnér, Per Olsson Frid, thank you very, very much for a wonderful panel. Now I would just like to remind those who are watching that we have another session coming up at 16:45 to 17:45. It is a strategic dialogue on global trends, violence, and the coronavirus. So I hope that you can stay tuned and continue to then follow Stockholm Forum for the coming 2 weeks when we are working on all kinds of different issues related to peace and development. Thank you very, very much for being with us.